this is page 42 in your booklet. So our last section in our reproduction unit is going to be the study of genetics. So we're going to focus mainly on the first 4 outcomes here, looking at single trait inheritance, differentiating between dominant and recessive traits, which is what you saw in that booklet you just did, describing the relationship between DNA, chromosomes, genes, and then how those traits are expressed, so what you look like. And we'll get into sex-linked traits, and we'll use a pedigree, which is like a family tree that tracks genetic traits, to look at that inheritance of that single trait. Okay. The next ones, if we have time, we'll loosely touch on them or come back to them. It's more of a project-based thing, and I'm just not sure we have enough time in our current reality. So what is genetics? So basically, genetics is the study of inheritance of traits from one generation to the next. So what you inherited from your parents, what you might pass on to any future children, that sort of thing. That study is called genetics. So we know, or you maybe have looked at your family or another family that you know, and maybe you notice that you look similar to a parent or the other parent, or similar to your siblings, but not identical. So we know that children tend to resemble their parents in appearance. They generally have similar features like maybe eye color or hair texture or height or other characteristics, because children inherit genes, which are like packages of information that control specific characteristics from those parents. So researchers have shown that genes are part of DNA molecules, and DNA molecules are contained in chromosomes that are found in the nucleus of each of our cell bodies. So if you remember back to mitosis, I talked to you about the DNA, how it's all kind of unwound in the nucleus, right? And then in preparation for cell division, it starts to wind up into those kind of X's that we think of as a chromosome. So I equated it to like spool or thread that was off the spool, right? This is our DNA. It's like thread that's been unwound from the spool. In order to kind of divide it up in cell division, we need to package it up. This is like thread on the spool. This is the chromosome. But what we haven't talked about yet is those chromosomes have coding regions. And those are called genes. So those regions might code for hair color or eye color or some other form of a trait. Okay. And that's what we're going to look at over the next few days. So each gene is a segment of that DNA that gives instructions. It's a coding region. So it typically gives instructions for making a protein. One gene codes for a protein. One protein typically codes for one enzyme. So one gene gives the instructions for making a protein enzyme. And the one example I'm going to give you is one making melanin. Now melanin is a gene that either tells to your skin that it can deposit pigments or your hair. So you either have coloring or you don't have coloring. That's what melanin is. So it's the pigment which contributes to the color of skin, eyes, and hair. So different versions of the gene or different versions of the trait, brown eyes, blue eyes, blonde hair, brown hair, black hair, those are called alleles. So they code for different kind of versions of the protein. So in terms of melanin, one allele of this gene codes for the enzyme that makes melanin, and that results in normally pigmented skin and hair. So we might symbolize that as a capital A. Another version of this gene, or another allele, symbolized by the lowercase a, codes for an enzyme that does not allow for pigmentation to be deposited in your skin and your hair. So if you lack that ability to kind of put coloring in your skin, your hair, that's called albinism. And people with albinism or albinos have very, very light colored skin, light, almost white hair, and kind of a reddish tinge to their eyes. So that's just one different version and one way that your genes code for kind of your traits. We're going to use some more common traits and we're going to simplify them a lot. So we, in terms of genetics, we use a capital letter, so for example, a capital A, to symbolize a dominant allele. And if something's dominant, it means it's stronger or it's the boss, right? A lowercase letter, and it's always, the dominant letter and lowercase letter are always the same letter, upper or lowercase. Okay, does that make sense? We don't use like a capital G and then a lowercase b. So the lowercase letter, it symbolizes the recessive allele. This is kind of like the hidden one. Dominant traits only need one dominant allele to be shown. So you get 2 copies of every chromosome or every gene from your parents, one from each parent, right? You can either have big A, that's 2 copies of that dominant allele, and you'll have that trait, whatever it is. Or you can have a dominant allele and that recessive allele, but this gets hidden. You might never know it's there. Recessive traits are traits that need 2 copies of that recessive allele in order to be expressed. So you have to have 2 of those little A's. Because we get a copy from mom, a copy from dad, so we have 2 copies of all our kind of alleles or genes. And the second we get a dominant allele, a capital letter, we show that dominant trait. So the only way to show that recessive trait is by having 2 of those recessive alleles. Does that make sense? It's really important that you understand dominant and recessive, as well as these next terms. So the next terms are a little bit tricky to learn, but it's important that we learn this technical language so we understand what our questions are asking. So genotypes are those different combinations of the genes or the alleles that you can have. That's called a genotype. So what's the coding on your chromosomes actually say? So if you have 2 copies of the dominant allele, you're called homozygous dominant. That prefix homo means the same. And you might have heard that in terms of a homosexual couple. You have 2 of the same, like 2 males or 2 females. So I don't mean any disrespect by that, but what I'm trying to show you is that you've already probably learned that prefix before. You just might not have known exactly what it meant. And it might help you to make connections if you forget in the future. So zygous comes from that word zygote, that fertilized egg, right? So we are the same dominant. So for homozygous dominant, we have 2 of the dominant alleles that are signified by those capital letters. Heterozygous, that prefix hetero means different. So if you're heterozygous, you have different alleles. So you have a dominant and a recessive allele. Convention says we always write that capital allele or capital letter first. And if you're homozygous recessive, you're the same, but in this case, you're the same for that recessive allele. And this is the only way for that recessive trait to be shown. So when I'm asking for your genotypes, I want to know whether you're homozygous dominant, like big A, whether you're heterozygous, big A, little a, or homozygous recessive, little a, little a. But if I was to ask you what your phenotype is, that's what's actually displayed, is your phenotype. So I like to tell students, remember that phenotype starts with a PH, and so does kind of physical expression, physical appearance. So if I ask what your phenotype is, I don't want to know whether you've got a big B and a little b for brown hair. I want to know whether your hair is brown or blonde. So if we're talking about hair color, for example, the dominant phenotype would be brown hair, and the recessive phenotype would be blonde hair. So if I gave you that you were heterozygous for your brown hair, or your heterozygous for your hair color, this is your genotype. What's your phenotype? What color is your hair going to be? It's going to be brown. Does that kind of make sense? This just takes practice and, again, reviewing your flashcards with those terms on it. Okay? So you've got some practice questions on page 43. So I'm going to run through those really quickly, and then I'd like you to do them. If you're watching the video, I want you to kind of listen to the instructions and then pause the video, and then we'll go over the answers. So for the practice questions, the first question says, state the type of allele, dominant or recessive. So for these letters here, some of them are capital, some of them are lowercase. For the capital letters, I want you to write dominant beside it. For the lowercase letters, recessive. On the next one, oops, I've got the answers up there. Quick. I want to state the genotype. So I want you to tell me whether this is homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous for each of these. Does that make sense? And for the last one, I want you to state the phenotype. So the dominant trait is brown eyes. And the recessive trait would be blue eyes. So I want you to look at these, and your options are going to be, you're going to either write brown or blue there. Okay? Does that make sense? So take a minute, go through them, and then we'll pop the video back on, and we'll go over those in just kind of 2 minutes. Okay? So so we're back on page 43 looking at the very first example. So if I've got a capital B, is that a dominant or recessive allele? That's a dominant one. And I'm just going to, well, actually, I'll write the whole word. What about little b? Dominant or recessive? That's recessive. Good, thank you. Little p, also recessive. Again, anytime you see that lowercase letter, it's recessive. And a big T, that's a dominant trait. Thank you very much. Okay, in terms of the next one, I asked you if you could tell me whether it was homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous. So if I've got two capital C's, capital letters are signified by dominant traits, right? So is that homozygous dominant or heterozygous? That's homozygous, so the same, and then dominant.
And then the hetero is right?
Hetero means they're different. So
Uppercase and lowercase.
yes, absolutely. So if I have two little d's, that's still homozygous, it's still the same. But in this case, it's not homozygous dominant, it's homozygous recessive. If I have a capital and a lowercase, that is heterozygous. They're different.
Wait. Oh, I wrote zygo. Or like that.
Just fix it. And capital R, again, homozygous dominant. Thanks. Well, it's just, hopefully, if you find it easy, that's great. It's just a matter of trying to keep everything straight. The last one is a little bit trickier. Okay, so the last one, again, I gave you their genotypes, those two combinations of alleles, and I asked you if brown eyes is dominant, and that's signified with a big B, and recessive is blue eyes, so that would be the little b. I asked you to state their phenotype. That's their physical expression. So if I've got a big B and a little b, am I going to have brown or blue eyes? Brown. So as soon as I have that capital letter, I'm going to have brown eyes. So big B, I would still have brown eyes. Thank you. And little b, blue.
Would it ever be lowercase b and then uppercase b?
Convention is we write big B, little b, just to keep things straight. I don't